Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Hudson Institute. My name is Miles Yu. I'm the director of Hudson Institute's China Center. So we're very pleased today to host a panel of experts about the issue that's on the mind of many people, and is particularly poignant when we talk about the spread of all this violence and all kinds of security repression, not only just from China, but also from other parts of the world. But we have this very good opportunity to see the publication of a very important report by the prestigious Hong Kong Watch. And Hong Kong Watch is on the forefront of monitoring the deterioration of rights in Hong Kong. And today we're going to focus on the religious freedom issue. We have with us today Benedict Rogers, the primary author of this report and co-founder and chief executive of Hong Kong Watch. Ben has a long and distinguished career defending human rights, particularly in East Asia. He is the author of 6 books, most recently, The China Nexus, which we have some copies for the audience here. It's right here. And he's a great friend of the China Center and the Hudson Institute. We're also blessed to have Hudson, to have us within our teams and the leading experts in Washington on issues of human rights and religious freedom, both in China, throughout East Asia, and beyond. First is a senior fellow, Nila Shea. She is a director of the Hudson's Center for Religious Freedom, and she has a distinguished career as a human rights lawyer and has been a leader in human rights and religious freedom movement internationally. She's also the recipient of the very prestigious Bradley Prize. She's recognized internationally, in other words. Next, we have Nuri Turko, who is internationally famous, and you can see his pictures in a lot of places. And he's a lawyer and a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. He's the author of No Escape, the true story of China's genocide of the Uyghurs, which won the Moore Prize for Human Rights Prize. Nuri has long been on the forefront of human rights issues and advocacy. And in addition to his work at the Hudson, he was also a congressionally appointed commissioner and a former chair of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedoms. And of course, we have Olivia Enos. Olivia, who recently joined us from another part of the town, and she's a senior fellow specializing in human rights and international security in Asia. She's also a professor at the Georgetown University and a columnist at the Forbes magazine. So welcome, panelists. And so today we're going to have the major author of the report, the founder and leader of the Hong Kong Watch, Ben Rogers, to give us a brief report on the report itself, and then followed by our panelists' comments, and then after that will be a Q&A. So without further ado, and I'm going to introduce you to the podium, Benedict Rogers.
Thank you very much. Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much indeed, Miles, for your kind introduction. A big thank you to the Hudson Institute for hosting this event. And it's a huge privilege to share this panel with the other distinguished speakers, with Miles, with my longtime friends, Nina, Nuri, and Olivia. I've been in different parts of the world with both Nina and Nuri, and known Olivia for a number of years as well. So it's great to be with you, and I look forward to the discussion. This report that you have executive summaries, I think, on the seats before you, and there are hard copies available for those of you that are really keen and want to read the whole report, and of course it's on our website as well, is, I believe, the first of its kind, the first report, aside, of course, from the US State Department and US Commission on International Religious Freedoms work on Hong Kong. It's the first report by an NGO on specifically religious freedom in Hong Kong. We launched it last week in the European Parliament in Brussels. We're launching it next week in the Canadian Parliament in Ottawa, and at the end of the month in the UK Parliament. And I can't think of a better place to be for the Washington, D.C. discussion than the Hudson Institute. I think the report is particularly timely, and there's a certain amount of hard work we obviously can put into researching and writing the report and publicizing it, but some things are beyond our control. Sometimes the Chinese Communist Party can be very helpful in terms of providing timely news angles, and they've done so on this occasion. This report comes a week after at least 10 Catholic bishops from around the world signed a letter calling for the release of the prominent Hong Kong political prisoner, Jimmy Lai, and of course they were denounced very vociferously by the Hong Kong government for doing so. It also comes on the very day today that the Chinese state-controlled Archbishop of Beijing, who is also the president of the state-controlled Chinese Patriotic Catholic Association, Bishop Joseph Li Shan, begins an unprecedented 5-day visit to Hong Kong. I don't think there's been a time that I can recall where the most senior member of the state-controlled church in mainland China has visited Hong Kong, and I think that is an ominous sign. And it also comes a few days after the Bishop of Shanghai, who of course was appointed by the state in China without the Vatican's approval, made comments about sinicization. And I'm sure that will be a theme that we will explore both later in my remarks and in the discussion that we have. I titled the report, Sell Out My Soul, essentially because I think that phrase conveys the increasing compromises of conscience which religious believers in Hong Kong are now required to make in order to protect what little remains of religious freedom, or more specifically, freedom of worship. But it was also inspired, and I don't know if this is known to an American audience, but in England there's a very popular Anglican hymn, which is Tell Out My Soul. And I happened to hear Tell Out My Soul being sung, and I thought that inspired this phrase, Sell Out My Soul, the very opposite of the meaning of that hymn. One of the key messages of the report is that freedom of worship, narrowly defined, is still intact in Hong Kong. People can still go to church, to the mosque, to the temple, to the synagogue, to places of worship, and they can still access religious literature. But to quote the authors of the foreword to the report, people who will be very familiar to you, the former US Ambassador for International Religious Freedom, Sam Brownback, and the UK Prime Minister's Special Envoy for Religious Freedom, Fiona Bruce. They say freedom of religion or belief is about so much more than simply the right to go to a place of worship once a week. It is about more than the right to go to church on Sundays, to the mosque on Fridays, the temple or the synagogue, or any other place of worship. It is, as expressed in Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a fully fledged expression of conscience. Interpreted in this way, this basic and fundamental human right is clearly under increasing and intensifying threat in Hong Kong. The report sets out 4 ways in which this is the case. Firstly, the impact of the draconian national security law in Hong Kong, which was imposed in July 2020, combined with potential new restrictive and repressive laws to come, especially the forthcoming Article 23 that the Hong Kong government has said they will introduce, which is an anti-subversion law, but also crowdfunding legislation that will have a severe impact on the ability of religious organizations and others to raise funds, and the possibility, not yet spelt out, but certainly rumored and trailed in pro-Beijing media of specific regulations to control religion, and perhaps the introduction of a government department on religious affairs. Secondly, and related to the draconian legislation, there is the widespread self-censorship by religious leaders. It is now almost impossible to find religious clergy in Hong Kong who will preach in their sermons anything explicitly or even implicitly related to human rights, human dignity, freedom, or justice. Thirdly, the impact on the education sector. Over 60% of Hong Kong's government-funded schools are run by church organizations, and the inevitable consequence of the Chinese Communist Party's interference with the curriculum in Hong Kong, the introduction of national security education, the distortion of the teaching of history, changing it to the CCP's narrative, all of that is having an impact on church-run schools. And lastly, as I referred to earlier, Beijing's campaign of sinicization of religion and the patriotism test. The report looks at the cases of religious clergy who have already been arrested, imprisoned, and threatened. Admittedly, you might say, well, they were arrested or imprisoned or threatened for their political pro-democracy activities rather than directly their religious activities. But nonetheless, the restriction of their freedom of conscience relates to religious freedom because they are people who supported democracy inspired and informed by their religious convictions. The most notable examples of these are, of course, the amazing, courageous Cardinal Zen, who at the age of 90 last year was arrested. Pastor Gary Pang, who has spent 12 months in jail. Pastor Alan Kung. And my good friend, Pastor Roy Chan, who was with me in the European Parliament in Brussels last week, who, after he and his good neighbor North District Church had played a key role in the protests in 2019 in helping protesters, providing them sanctuary, providing them protection, first aid, pastoral care. His church was raided. HSBC, under direction of the authorities, froze both the church's bank accounts and his own bank accounts. He's now in exile in the UK. The report looks at the role of the pro-Beijing media in all of this. The newspaper Ta Kung Pao, which is owned by the Chinese government's liaison office in Hong Kong, in January 2022 published an unprecedented 4 articles in one edition, attacking religion in general and Christianity in particular, and calling specifically for new restrictions and regulations on religious affairs, including the establishment of a government department. So in conclusion, as I said at the outset, freedom of worship, narrowly defined, is still intact for the time being. But freedom of religion or belief in its fullest form is under increasing threat, as I've just outlined. In a sense, it is inevitable for 2 reasons. Firstly, when freedom itself is dismantled, sooner or later religious freedom is going to be impacted. You can't have religious freedom without freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and freedom of association. But secondly, the Chinese Communist Party is always and has always been inherently hostile to religion. So as it exerts greater direct control of Hong Kong and destroys the concept of one country, 2 systems and Hong Kong's autonomy, it was always likely that it would seek to restrict, control, coerce, and co-opt religion. So what should we do? Well, I believe we should pay much closer attention to the situation in Hong Kong. We have recommendations in the back of the report calling specifically on governments around the world that have mechanisms, envoys, ambassadors at large on religious freedom to monitor Hong Kong more closely. And most of all, the United States, which has been the pioneer in this field. We call on the ambassador at large for international religious freedom and the US Commission on International Religious Freedom to pay closer attention to Hong Kong, particularly as the new laws, Article 23 and the others that I mentioned, come into force. But we also call on other governments to do the same, and the UN Special Rapporteur for freedom of religion or belief to pay attention as well. And I end, as I close, with some remarks from a wonderful religious scholar who I won't name, but who said these very insightful words that conclude the report. He said, "The most violent form of attack on religious freedom is not necessarily the burning of churches and the killing of believers, which we are not yet seeing in Hong Kong, but of course we see very much in mainland China. For the persecutors kill the bodies, but not the souls. Rather, the more dangerous and insidious attack on a religion could be its corruption from within, so that believers can only practice the faith in name rather than in essence. In this regard, the CCP is about to use the latter strategy to attack religious freedom in Hong Kong. Why? Hong Kong is still an international city, despite everything that has happened. It is still one of the world's major international financial centers. Closing Christian schools and churches may still be too shocking to foreign expatriates and affect the city's international reputation. So rather, the CCP can restrict religious freedom by using an insidious means, corrupting Christian education and exerting total control on churches without actually closing them. And that is, I think, the real danger before us, that it is an insidious campaign. It is, for those who are not looking, difficult to see. But having said that, when you do start looking, you can see it, you can see the insidiousness of it, and people around the world of conscience and conviction should start speaking out for people of faith in Hong Kong who are very soon no longer able to speak for themselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben. So now we have, all our panelists have read the report, so I'd like to ask each one of them to say a few words about this report, what your reaction. So let's start with Nina.
Thank you, Miles, for this putting together this panel today, and thank you, Ben, for this wonderful report and the aptly named "Sell Out My Soul." And I am also honored to be with my colleagues here at Hudson on the panel, Nori and Olivia, who are real experts in the field. There's so much to say about this. To see the swallowing in slow motion of Hong Kong and stamping out the freedoms of a proud people, proud of their freedoms, and who've exercised them so energetically and with fervor and willing to go to jail. I think there's something like 1,707 prisoners at last count on November 10th, political prisoners in Hong Kong today. And many others have left their homeland to find freedom elsewhere. I want to pick up on a couple points quickly, Ben, and one is, let's start with "Sell Out My Soul." And there are two sellouts, as far as I can see, or maybe three. One is President Biden today is meeting with Xi Jinping in San Francisco. And we learned that on his agenda, there are no human rights at all, and no international human rights and freedoms, and there's certainly not religious freedom, even for the Uyghur genocide, which is just amazing. It's just so disappointing. It's shocking. There is very little reason for the administration has other priorities. They're important too. But human rights is a pillar of our foreign policy, and the International Religious Freedom Act made that clear. There's also this, you mentioned self-censorship in the report of the religious communities in Hong Kong, where they don't want to protest about what is happening to them, and it makes it all the more insidious because you can't see it. And this Bishop Lee, who's the head of the Patriotic Catholic Association, made an historical journey, as we learned from the Vatican press that to Hong Kong, the first from the Patriotic Church, Hong Kong has not, Catholics have not been under the Patriotic Church, the Protestants have not been under the Three Self-Patriotic movement. And it looks like they're headed that way. And this is very bad because this is now an arm of the United Front Work Department of the Chinese Communist Party. It's formally it's basically a shell organization and is controlled by the United Front Work Department. And its purpose is to indoctrinate and surveil the church leaders to make sure that they're conforming and their congregations are conforming to communist ideology. In fact, Xi Jinping called it his magic weapon, this United Front Work Department. And it was created, the patriotic associations were created in the Mao era. So it will be the end of religious freedom if it goes in that direction. And I think it will. I think that we're going to see the Patriotic Association corral the Christians of Hong Kong, the patriotic associations, Protestant and Catholic. And that is because not only Bishop Lee is now engaged with Cardinal Chow in Hong Kong today or this week, but Cardinal Chow, then Bishop Chow in April went to Beijing. The Vatican, of course, approved this and encouraged it. They call him a bridge. That is, the Catholic Church calls Cardinal Chow a bridge. And they act like they present it as if it's a great historical move, that there's going to be unity in the church now. So the unity is going to be under the Patriotic Association, which is going to be devastating for the Catholics because there is a pledge, an oath that is required of all its members to distance themselves from any foreign influence. That would mean the Vatican, from the Pope. So it's this really self-destructive move, but they've done that in mainland. The Vatican, that is, has approved as of 2019, for the first time in history, for Catholic bishops to take the pledge and join this patriotic association. The Protestant, you point out that the Anglican General Secretary in Hong Kong, Reverend Peter Kuhn, has actually suggested that there be some kind of government oversight body for the Protestant churches in Hong Kong. So you have this willingness to accept it without complaint on the part of people with international presence on the world stage who have a lot of moral authority, and compounded by President Biden's own demotion of religious freedom and human rights in our Sino-American relations. So is my time up then?
Oh, you have 2 more minutes.
2 more minutes, I know. Miles always keeps me on Navy time, so he's very strict about this.
Navy beat Army.
And then you have to ask, Ben, you talked about this at the end of your talk just now. Why is this insidiousness pursued as a policy by Beijing? Why aren't they rounding up all the Christians and putting them in the detention camps like they do in Xinjiang? And I think he's right that it's about trade. China's going through a period of decline at the moment. It may reverse, but it's population decline, investment decline, so there's even the Belt and Road Initiative is apparently in some trouble. I've been reading. So it's a period where they're trying to keep alive the economy and financial hub that Hong Kong was, and it would look very bad in the West for the Christians to be rounded up or forcibly sterilized or enslaved, like is happening with the Uyghur Muslims. And in fact, it's happening with this kind of repression, this Sinicization of religion is happening with every religious group. And they, discuss how, in fact, there was in that Tung Kung Pao outlet, there was a barrister who mentions, and it's in your report, that Christian religions are incompatible with China because they don't have ancestor worship. But if you look at the Asian religions, they haven't really fared any better. In fact, much worse. Falun Gong has been eliminated. I mean, that's what they set out to do. That's what Beijing set out to do. And they've succeeded in at least driving it very much underground. And in the process, having a kill-to-order policy targeting Falun Gong and the Uyghurs for their organ harvesting. Really ghastly human rights abuse. So I think my 2 minutes are up. So to be continued.
Okay, thank you. Nuri?
Thank you, Miles. Thank you. Let me begin by thanking Miles for bringing us together here. It's an important topic that I have been literally immersed in the last 3.5 years since I've been with the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. On that note, I wanted to recommend you to listen to Miles's podcast, China Insider, to get yourself educated and informed on a wide range of issues. I've been recently tuning into his Chinese version to polish up my Mandarin Chinese, even though I went to college in China. It got really rusty after living in the United States in the last 28
Well,
years.
Nuri, if I knew you were a listener to the podcast, I would have been much more serious.
Thank you. So going back to our topic, I agree with Nina that the name for this report is so significant and it speaks volume. A few years ago, before Jimmy Lai was arrested, he was in Washington meeting with Secretary Pompeo, Vice President Mike Pence. And he said that Hong Kong is in the front line to defend freedom and religious freedom, democratic freedom and religious freedom. He also said that the CCP leadership believes that the people of China, people of Hong Kong, should make themselves gratified and feel indebted to the leadership in Beijing because they have a place to sleep and food to eat. And Jimmy Lai found it very offensive, and he said that the leadership want us to think that we're a kind of animal who would not appreciate other things in life like desire, longing, and spirituality. So, so this name particularly relevant to that point that Jimmy Lai made, and also has something relates to the environment that I grew up before making the United States home. I grew up in a Uyghur heartland, and I watched and listened, actually been in the mosque to listen to the sermons by the Uyghur imams, government appointed, much like what Ben was describing about those religious leaders in Hong Kong. Literally distorting the religion, promoting the Communist Party ideology. As you know, that CCP ideology and religion are not compatible. The CCP leadership have figured it out a long time ago, whereas in the free world, including our country, has not really had a strong understanding or deep understanding of that very specific things that the leadership has in mind. So these individuals, the so-called religious leaders, not only self-censoring them, distorting the religion, much like in Hong Kong, but they're also helping to justify and normalize religious persecution, which still exists. For example, there's a place called Xinjiang Institute for Islamic Studies. It's a government-funded, believe it or not, there's a college in Urumqi, in the heartland, capital of Urumqi, set up by the Chinese government that is specifically training pro-CCP religious leaders. So the president of that university has been in the front line justifying and helping to normalize the acts of genocide committed by the PRC leadership today. So they're not only self-censored, but also help to promote and advance the Chinese leadership's long-term agenda. One other thing that, as I was reading the report, Ben talked a lot about destruction of religious sites yet. That's a physical damage. But when you look at the CCP leadership's long-term goal, or the way that they see religion, is much more dangerous than removing the cross or destroying a place of worship. If you look back, the way that Xi Jinping has been talking about religion in the context of foreign encirclement since 2012, he has been telegraphing very concerning policy agenda. And specifically in 2014, as part of the national security strategy, this was actually way before the national security law in Hong Kong came to existence. So Xi Jinping essentially said that China is facing worsening threat, and CCP must preemptively crush those threats before they destroy its rule and derail its grand plan for the future. So that encirclement, the threat aspect, is relating to people's desire to practice their religion. And also the way that Xi Jinping regime, and in the case of the Christians and the Muslims, because of their connection to the outside world, actually Ben has also talked about it in the report, that some of the religious leaders' connection to the outside world also been perceived as some sort of potential threat or cause for political upheaval. So what are they doing? They're using medical metaphor, as you have been reading in the news, likening religious practitioners to somebody who have mental illness. It started with the Falun Gong. The world did not say anything. And now they're calling Uyghur people who have infectious disease, and the government must cure before it spreads the vital organs of the state. So they're using that kind of medical metaphor, not only insulting the religious practitioners, but also in a very skilled and subtle way to destroy religious belief. Because the CCP leadership genuinely believes that religious practitioners' lack of loyalty to the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, they should not be loyal to their creator, their God, should be grateful to Xi Jinping. And now you must study the Xi Jinping thoughts as opposed to Quran and Bible. And then the other thing is that, as I noted earlier, that the state has to need to do anything that they can, even in the one case that the CCP leadership used terms like, you cannot take out weeds one by one, but you have to spray chemical. So they use that kind of a terminology, and people usually don't pay attention. That's essentially their policy agenda. That's a policy approach. So, I will stop after this. I had a chance to visit with a top diplomat at the Vatican early this year. I had a meaningful conversation. It was pretty long, actually, surprisingly. He gave me about 45 minutes to sit down with him. And I asked him three things. One, can you stop the Chinese from distorting religion, the Sinicization project that Nina was mentioning? They're literally rewriting Quran and a Bible. That's not religion. So, and the second ask is that, can you speak out on behalf of the Catholics in mainland China? When the Catholic Church, Vatican speaks, billion of people at least will listen to. And their influence cannot be understated. And then the third thing I ask, can you stop the Chinese to force Catholics in China to sign on to this Patriotic Catholic Association, which is part of this Chinese Communist Party? So when you sign you sign on to this organization, you're essentially walking away from your religious belief. And these are not earth-shaking requests that the Vatican should be considered. And in the report, I hope that you include this, maybe in the next report. I think we should be focusing on places like Vatican that could be instrumental in changing and helping to save people's spirituality.
Okay, Nuri, thank you. That was very thoughtful commentary. Olivia.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Miles, for inviting me here today, and Ben, for your truly excellent report. I really enjoyed reading it. It's a delight for me to be here today to talk about an issue that's near and dear to my heart, not only because my previous job, and my former colleague Francis is sitting here, was at the Committee for Freedom in Hong Kong Foundation, but also because I am a person of faith myself. I'm a Christian. And I'm sure that these issues are likewise near and dear to everyone on this panel's heart, but also to folks who are sitting here in the audience. And I think religious freedom is so important because it's about so many core things. It's about protecting every individual's right to live out their most closely held beliefs. It's about protecting beliefs that affect how we live and even affect what we believe about what happens when we die. These beliefs are deeply personal, and frankly speaking, they have absolutely nothing to do with the government. That's why it's so appalling to watch what the government in China is doing and what the Hong Kong authorities are doing, whether you're a Christian, whether you're a Muslim, Buddhist, Falun Gong, you name it. It does not matter what religion you practice. They are after you. And to see the hallmarks and the early warning signs of what's happening in the People's Republic of China occurring in Hong Kong today is so alarming, and I think you laid that out so beautifully, Ben, in the report. So for the remainder of our time together, I want to highlight 3 themes, and then I want to talk about some policy next steps that we can take to hopefully alleviate some of these challenges. So one of the themes in the report, and I thought this was so important, Ben, was the role of religious institutions in standing on the side of freedom in Hong Kong. So the report talks about how many churches and religious institutions offered safe haven to protesters during 2019 protests. And they didn't just offer physical safe haven like food and water and whatever on the day-to-day. They offered resources, and they also joined hands in common cause. And we saw a lot of signs of faithfulness even like within the protests themselves. And I think that religious institutions' role in protests is not unique to China. This is actually like very typical in a lot of different contexts, and I think especially in communist and post-communist countries historically. I can say with confidence as a person of Christian faith that at the core of the Christian faith is a commitment to freedom, freedom from sin through Christ's redemption on the cross. But specifically in Romans 8:20 through 21, it said, it puts creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God. And while Christianity comes not to provide any sort of political solution per se, it's coming to provide primarily religious freedom. I think it's interesting how many believers often stand on the side of causes of freedom all throughout the globe as image bearers of God. And I think that's really important. To draw a clearer parallel, I work on human rights issues in Asia more generally. And I think we see this theme come up repeatedly, specifically in North Korea. The North Korean government is so scared of Christians. It will send 3 generations of Christians to political prison camps for mere possession of a Bible. Sometimes they'll even publicly execute individuals for having a Bible. It's terrifying, but the reason given by the Kim regime is actually not that different from in China. It's because the regime is fearful of believers because of the role that they've played historically in pro-freedom movements that are opposed to communism and its root causes. So I think it's no surprise that people of faith were involved in the pro-democracy movement, and I think it was so great that you highlighted that, Ben, in the report. The second theme that I thought was incredibly important, and my other co-panelists have raised this already, is that there are a number of religious prisoners of conscience that are in Hong Kong right now. I think it's important that we say their names. Jimmy Lai has come up, Benny Tai is another one, Joshua Wong as well. And of course, even if they're not serving out in prison, Martin Lee and Agnes Chow and Cardinal Zen are all facing persecution because of their faith. And I think there's no more clear attempts at silencing people than to put them in prison and to take legal action against them. And when you have a situation like that, that should cause all of us around this table to sit there and say, what can we do to help them and to be their voices when they can't speak for themselves, as Ben, you aptly said at the beginning. Here's my sort of slight disagreement, counter-argument. We might even agree on this to some extent. But the report causes us to ask a question. Will believers in Hong Kong face the same fate as believers in the People's Republic of China? I think this is the core question we all wonder, especially as we note these hallmarks. Ben, I appreciated how careful you were to not overstate the severity of religious freedom threats in Hong Kong today. Your analysis about the insidious and pervasive nature of self-censorship was absolutely correct. But I found myself disagreeing with you when you said that it was unlikely that believers in Hong Kong would face the same fate as folks in the PRC. And part of my reason for saying this is because I think some of what Nuri was saying or has said in the past about the situation facing Uyghurs. Actually, for quite a long time in China, Uyghurs faced lower levels of forms of persecution, but actually enjoyed a certain amount of freedom. And I'll just give like one anecdote here. Even though there was a one-child policy throughout the entirety of the country, some Uyghur families were allowed to have more than one child because their religion was calling upon them to have more children, and China was permissive of that. But of course, we see what's happened to Uyghurs today. That persecution has ramped up to what we would now call ongoing genocide and crimes against humanity. So I think we can't be too on guard when it comes to what the CCP could possibly do in Hong Kong. And I think seeing the well-documented hallmarks that you laid out in the report of early warning signs makes me really concerned. And I'm happy to go into that a little bit more in Q&A. But I don't want to take too much more time, and I do want to get to recommendations. I believe there are things that the US government and the international community can do. Ben laid out, I think, 4 or 5 really excellent recommendations that I would commend to everyone that you would read from the report. And I think there's a lot that can be done internationally. But as far as what Congress and the executive branch can do, 1, we have to prioritize religious prisoners of conscience. Members of Congress have the ability to adopt political prisoners. In fact, I think Jamie Raskin is planning to adopt Jimmy Lai, both as a religious prisoner of conscience, but as a political prisoner generally. USERF has actually adopted Jimmy Lai as a religious prisoner of conscience. And what that means is that those institutions are spending more time mobilizing to try and get Jimmy free. We gotta do that for more people, not just for Jimmy, for more people than just Jimmy. Second, we gotta use all of the tools that we have at our disposal in the US, specifically sanctions tools, perhaps under Global Magnitsky, maybe even the creation of new tools that target individuals and entities who are specifically responsible for religious freedom violations, not just in Hong Kong, but elsewhere. And why not time it with the release every year of State Department's International Religious Freedom Report? Actually issue a list of people who are persecuting individuals abroad and target them financially, make them pay for locking individuals up and targeting people on religious grounds. And then third and finally, we have to use diplomatic pressure to ensure that the Vatican's deal with Beijing, which I think Nina mentioned earlier, is not automatically extended to Hong Kong. It's not clear whether it currently extends to Hong Kong. I'm sure Beijing could find a sneaky way to argue that, but I think this is one other action item that the US government should be considering. So thank you.
Thank you, Olivia, for this very thoughtful comments. So on a normal circumstance, I would like Ben to answer some of the points that are raised here. But let's just go to the Q&A. Maybe you have time, opportunity to ask, because actually some of the questions raised is question I'm going to ask you, all of you, and you can use your time to answer that. You know, as we speak right now, there are 2 important meetings taking place simultaneously. One is in California. It's the enemy of freedom, General Secretary Xi Jinping from China, and the President of the United States, Joe Biden, who himself is a practicing Catholic. And the religious freedom is not even on the agenda. So another very important meeting is taking place right now, as you are seeing, because we're touching on some of the very fundamental element of the U.S.-China relationship. We cannot just do things on a transactional basis. We have to go to the conceptual and ideological basis that guides the transactional engagement between U.S. and China. So let me just go to the question. Now, you know, there's a lot of people in Hong Kong who become heroes of the world. Their resistance was momentous and very inspiring. Jimmy Lai, of course, is the symbol of that movement, and Cardinal Zen also is that. Now, soon after the publication of your report, and there was a letter signed by 10 Catholic bishops demanding specifically for the immediate and unconditional release of Jimmy Lai, who is more of the political prisoner than a victim of conscience. Which brings me to a question that touched upon by some of the panelists. I think Nuri mentioned this. You know, on this, the leading voice of protest should come from the Vatican, should become the Pope. So we don't see much of the focused interest from the leadership of the Catholic Church on the plight, not just of political prisoners, but also religious prisoners of conscience. So my question to all of you is very briefly, is there a doctrinal and theological hesitancy to criticize the Pope, who could play a very important role because Cardinal Zen is the most courageous cardinal I've ever seen. He makes no compromise on issue of religious freedom, whose opinion is totally in contradiction with what the Pope wants to do. So that's why there's a very tense relationship between Cardinal Zen and the Pope. So who wants to go take the first crack? Ben, you want to go ahead? Yeah.
Sure. Well, I think my answer would be if you've read anything that Nina has written, and particularly her most recent article in National Review, headlined Pope She, and if you've read anything that I've written in particularly Catholic media, the Catholic Herald, the Tablet, in the last few days and for some time, I think we would both say, no, absolutely, we're both Catholics, and there is nothing doctrinally or theologically to stop us criticizing the Pope on this issue, because doctrinally, this is not an issue of church doctrine. It's an issue of politics and diplomacy.
Yeah, I'm not talking about the people here. Obviously, you have no hesitancy.
Absolutely.
I'm talking about the Catholic community as a whole, particularly.
Well, I'll hand over to Nina in a moment, but I mean, I would say no. There's definitely nothing to stop Catholics criticizing the Pope and the Vatican on this issue, because it's not a matter of doctrine. It's a policy. It's a matter of the Vatican's diplomatic position, and indeed there are many Catholics, including bishops and cardinals, that have spoken out, and I hope there will be more.
Okay, great.
We noticed the Pope's glaring silence and unwillingness to use his spot on the global stage and moral authority to bring pressure on China on these pivotal cases and the fate of Hong Kong, actually. But it's actually, in my piece that Ben mentioned in the National Review magazine, the current issue in December, I argue that it's much worse than that. There's a cover-up. It's a policy of Ostpolitik that has been adopted by the Vatican. And I can imagine, Nori, that the answers to all your questions last summer were no, 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 and no, but maybe in a more sugar-coated way. But it's a deliberate policy that's been adopted by the Vatican of no criticism and no dissent against communist governments. And this was seen in Eastern Europe, and it's being applied now. It was seen in Eastern Europe until Pope John Paul II changed this policy to a more successful one of open, really, confrontation, verbal confrontation, of course. But there's been a deliberate confusion of terms by the Vatican to call synicization, which is this horrible repressive measure that Ben writes about, and that I've written about, all of us have written about, confusing it with enculturation, or adopting the manners and dress, the cultural appearance of the local community. And I guess the Reverend Kuhn of the Anglican Church is also doing the same thing, calling it localization. But this was it's quite different. It's not repression. And what was synicization is what is causing a genocide in Xinjiang, crackdowns on the Tibetan Buddhists and on Falun Gong, and is, right now, I think there are 1 million Tibetan children and 1 million Uyghur children who've been ripped from their families, taken from their homes, put in state institutions to be completely indoctrinated and have their culture erased. Love for humanity is being conflated with the Belt and Road policy. That's unbelievable. That's crazy. I mean, this is what Cardinal Chao came out from his meetings in Beijing saying, that the Pope that President Xi shares the same love for humanity as the Pope, as exemplified in the Common Destiny community, which is the Belt and Road, exemplified by Belt and Road. patriotism, love of the party. You talk about that in your report, Ben. Love of the country. Actually, it's a one-party regime, so it's a love of the CCP. These are the mantras that are being demanded by the government, and it's coming out of the mouths of these cardinals right now. Respect for the Pope. The Pope has said this, Pope Francis has said this, his top cardinals have said this, that the regime respects the Pope. Well, in what sense? They certainly don't respect his authority over the Catholic Church in China. So it's much worse than even silence. It's actually covering up and putting a happy face on this repression that's occurring across the board in China and Hong Kong.
Okay, so I'm going to ask Olivia to comment on this particular question of doctrinal and theological hesitancy among the Catholics. And then I'm going to ask Lurie to talk about the issue of sinicization of our religion, because that's more related to Xinjiang as a whole. Right, Olivia?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to broaden your question a little bit, if I may, and just say, like, in addition to the silence from the Pope and from other religious communities, the silence from the business community has been eerie when it comes to freedom in Hong Kong generally. And I think that there is just so much looking of the other way, and a desire to continue to see Hong Kong as this like flourishing business center, and to ignore the consequences of the undermining of rule of law that has had implications for, as Ben said, every single form of freedom. And I know you're asking Nuri as well about this question of sinicization. I just wanted to put a finer point on sinicization, because I think it sounds like a very large word, and it's like sounds kind of foreign. And I think a lot of people don't always know what it is. Sinicization is the secularization of religion. It's saying this is what the CCP believes to be true, and you can believe whatever it is that you want, so long as that comes secondary to the CCP. But the problem is that the CCP and God can't sit on the same throne. And so this effectively makes it so that religious practice is nullified and is subservient to the CCP and its goals and its ends. And that's what we're dealing with here, because it's an attempt to rewire thinking in a way that ultimately would lead someone away from their faith, not towards it. And I think that's so important. I'm sure Nuri will address it in more detail, but.
I would respectfully disagree a little bit about God and the communism do not mingle, because in China, if you die as a communist, you say you go to see Marx, right? So communism and God do exactly different. Which brings me to this kind of sinicization question, because I remember when I was working in the government during the previous administration, I wrote a report to Secretary of State about the issue of sinicization, because at the time China is launching this campaign to retranslation the Bible. Here's the thing: the directives from the Central Committee, Politburo, is that we're going to retranslate the Bible in compliance with socialist values. So it's not necessarily a secularization of religion. It's basically political communist ideologicalization of the Bible, so of religion. So that's basically is very important. They do this. They have a lot of very interesting things. Now, of course, the most famous Catholic in the history of China is the Italian Catholic Jesuit Matteo Ricci, who went to China in the late 16th century and died there in 1610. And he was a very successful Jesuit who converted a lot of people during the Ming Dynasty, yet he was sinicized. He dressed like Confucius. He read the Chinese characters. He knew the Chinese philosophy and the history and the ethics, yet he fundamentally remained a Catholic. He was faithful to his faith. So that's kind of a cynicization. I think
It's enculturation.
It's enculturation. Exactly right.
It's different from.
So my question to Nuri then is, March of we designate the Chinese Communist Party's atrocities in Xinjiang as genocide. A specific manifestation of that is the massive concentration camp system. Yeah. Now, they put it over there, not necessarily to basically destroy them and physically, but also to change their hearts and mind, to change their religious and cultural identity. Yeah. So in this case, Uyghurs are ethnic minority in China. They want to sinicize them, both culturally and religiously. Yeah. I'd like to hear your perspective.
Well, thank you, Miles. In my book that you mentioned, I have a chapter on this particular topic, this particular issue. I interviewed camp survivors and the victims of the ongoing genocide, and those American citizens who have family members in the camp. And the camp survivors consistently told me something quite disturbing. So every day morning, after attending the flag ceremony, they have to repeat something along the lines of, do you have a God? No. Who is your new God? Xi Jinping. That kind of indoctrination, if you are a strong religious believer, or if you have followed a spiritual life for years and maybe decades, the Uyghurs have been practicing Sunni Islam since 13th century. It's part of their gene, part of the value, part of the culture. That can break you. So it is gradually causing damage to that person physically. So in one of the frontline documentaries about the Uyghur genocide, a Chinese police officer told the journalists that the Uyghurs cannot be released to the society because they are all crazy now. So they will end up becoming social criminals. This is one aspect that, and the way that this started, this whole thing, also rather different than the rest of China. So sinicization, resisting to sinicization can subject you to criminal punishment. In April 2017, the local legislature issued something called de-extremification measure, criminalizing spiritual life, like adhering to halal diet, encouraging your family members to marry someone who is Muslim and Uyghur, abstention from alcohol, smoking, that sort of stuff, and then a growing beard, wearing religious garb. So with that is part of their strategy. They're changing textbook or culturalization was already in practice when I was living there, actually. So the resisting to the sinicization have subjected a large group of Uyghur people into the camp, and some of them actually serving prison time. That includes the family members of American citizens.
Okay, so let me just, if I read the report correctly, so correct me if I'm wrong, that sounds like obviously you recognize there is a certain, I think the phrase you use, religious freedom has been very intact. But I think I did see the phrases there that make a distinction, very critical distinction, that religion in Hong Kong, freedom of worship, has become more of a privilege rather than a right, because you have to be allowed to do something. So in that case, I think that's a very important distinction. And this report you wrote, that's the case. Religion seems to be intact. Freedom is seems to be intact. Is that, I quote, they want to create the impression that there is freedom of religion or belief, end of quote. So my question then is, Ben, why does the CCP even care about the facade? Considering what they have done to Hong Kong, right?
Well, just to clarify, what I was saying was that freedom of worship is intact, and that you can still go to church or the mosque or the temple, but freedom of religion is definitely, as I've outlined, is under increasing pressure. To answer your question, and then maybe I could also, this is a good opportunity to respond to Olivia's earlier comments. I think that for the time being, the CCP does care about the image of Hong Kong. I mean, firstly, they do everything they can to hide and deny the violations that they've carried out. They constantly attack. I mean, the response to the 10 Catholic bishops' letter over Jimmy Lai was very telling, that immediately the Hong Kong government denounced them, and which shows that they care about criticism. And I think they care about criticism because Hong Kong is still much more open to the world than perhaps the rest of China. There is still some level of internet freedom. I mean, it's censored, it's monitored, but the Great Firewall has not come into Hong Kong yet. And so there is much more awareness and scrutiny, I think. But also, I think that the CCP would prefer to, I think the objective is the same, but they would prefer to use less obvious means if those means can succeed. So if they can suppress religious freedom by co-opting, corrupting, controlling, rather than destroying and dynamiting, as they've done in the mainland, then they would prefer to use those tactics. And to come to Olivia's comments earlier, I think I would say that I agree with Olivia that the fate of religious believers in Hong Kong is the same as the fate of anyone living under the control of the CCP. But I think the means, for the time being, differ. So the CCP is using different, more insidious, more subtle means to achieve the same purpose. But I don't rule out also in the future, if those means don't achieve their objective, they may resort to more physical, violent means.
Yeah, and I was pretty sure that we had overlap in our agreement, but yeah, I just wanted to point that out, because I know one of the things that you had said, Ben, in the report was that, China and Hong Kong authorities, they care about what the international community thinks, and I think you even said in your comments that you were concerned that, for the international community and for expats that were based in Hong Kong, that it might be like a bridge too far to go after religious institutions. And I think that's a really good point, except for the fact that, as I was saying earlier, the business community hasn't responded in the way that you or I, and I think anyone in this room, would hope that they would respond to such severe degradations in freedom, that I just don't think that the CCP would stop, per se. So I think we agree, but yeah, that was just one of the things that kind of stood out to me when I was reading it. Yeah.
Can I pick up on a point here?
Yeah, please, yeah.
One thing that's really obviously hurting the churches and all the religions is a synicization rule to ban all youth from any exposure to religion. They can't go to Bible camp, they can't go to catechism, they can't go to church at all. And they are not to be educated in faith until they're 18. This is going to be devastating to the leadership of the future generation across the board. And that is one thing. There's going to be an acute shortage of leaders. Apparently there already is of Catholic priests in mainland China, according to the head of the patriotic government-controlled Bishops' Council. But there's also something else, and that is in mainland China, because of synicization that requires sort of the swapping out, as you said, Miles, of Christian ideology for communist ideology. And that Bible reference that you're talking about was very telling, because it was a Bible story about mercy, of showing mercy, not just following the law to its rigidly following the law, and that's what I thought of when I heard from the police files that were leaked about what was happening in Xinjiang with the genocide of the Uyghurs. That President Xi Jinping gave an order to his cadres: show no mercy. So mercy is a religious notion, and it is basically one of the things that's now you can't preach about. You have to preach about Xi's teachings, which would be the opposite of mercy. So anyhow, if you have this swapping out of ideology, what is the point to attending any religious service whatsoever? I mean, you're just subject to the same banal, repetitious sloganizing that you find in any local Socialist Institute or United Front. I mean, there's no point to going out on, Friday or Saturday or Sunday to hear the same thing. You're going to hear it in the indoctrination at the local level anyhow. So I think that will kill off religion. Both of those things, the lack of leadership from the youth ban and this swapping out of ideology, the religion will not survive. And that is the point. That's what they hope to happen, to hasten the withering away of religion.
Okay. Any other comments before I go to the next question? Go ahead.
Yeah, let me also bring up something that we haven't touched upon. The misuse of technology in the religious persecution in mainland China and related areas. This is a government, our government's public statement that 80 countries around the world have adopted Chinese surveillance technology. China today is the world's largest telecommunications provider, and they have also been a major player in the AI field. 75 countries use AI, and 60 of them related to Chinese technology firms, and 50 of them provided by Huawei. Why do I mention this? When you look at the way that the Uyghur genocide, this is a really good, thing. It's an important thing to be mindful of, because whatever happened in the Uyghur region, and maybe I don't want us to even think about it, but can be used in other places. So when the way that they locked up the Uyghur people, initially they established integrated joint operating platform, IJOP, Yiti Hua Shitong was the Chinese SIM. So they scoop up a lot of personal data from the WeChat, the Douyin, and importantly, there's a Silicon Valley developed app called Zapier that was specifically designed for exchanging religious text. So even to this day, many Uyghurs that I know, interviewed and regularly in contact, don't even know why their family members end up being in the camp. I mentioned this because in your report, you talked about the foreign contact. So that foreign contact could be reason they can charge them under the national security law. They can charge them under this extremism claim, and they also charge a religious leader under the espionage law. So we have to keep in mind that the technology that the Chinese developed is metastasizing, and also that's one of their potent tools to prop up dictators around the world. We at USERV we cover 27 countries, and when you look at it, pretty much all of them follows the Chinese model when it comes to repressing their own religious minority. And they are all a recipient of Chinese technological tools.
Okay, so let me just make a statement, see how you think about what I'm going to say. Many people talk about the Chinese religious policy and the religious practitioners, their activities and their beliefs. Can these two systems even coexist? Because what I'm saying is church, what constitutes the church or religion must have three basic elements. Leadership, right? You got the Pope, for example. And then you have the clergy, right? The organization structure. And then you have theology, you have belief, you have faith. The Chinese Communist Party has almost a similar hierarchical structure. They have a supreme leader, you call it chairman or now secretary general. And then you have this clergy of the communists too, because those are the cadres. Those are willing executioners on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party. And then you have obviously ideology, right? The theology and if you will. So because of that, the Chinese Communist government absolutely demand unanimity of leadership, structure, as well as ideology, right? So basically, what I'm trying to say is that it seems to me we really have to understand Chinese Communist Party's religious policy from the point of view of Chinese communism as atheism. They don't believe in any religious element at all. And I think, the Pope John Paul II realized that. The absolutely uncompromising, mutually exclusive nature of the two systems, if you will. And that's why Xi Jinping always say everything is a struggle. It's a struggle of life and death. He really means that. If there is a religious freedom in China, the Communist Party probably will be finished pretty soon. Just like what happened in Eastern Europe. So just hypothesis, what do you have to say about that?
Well, I mean, I would agree with you. I think that it's a real irony that, as you say, an avowedly atheist regime now has the power, with the agreement of the Vatican, to appoint Catholic bishops. It will presumably try to take the authority to choose the next reincarnation of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. I know Tibetan Buddhists won't allow that and won't accept that, but I'm sure Beijing will try to do that. But as you say, the two cannot sit side by side, and I think that Cardinal Chao, the new Cardinal of Hong Kong, when he visited Beijing earlier this year, he talked about, as Nina said earlier, the need to love the country, but what that really means is love the party. He also talked about the need for Catholics and Christians of all traditions to be, in his words, good citizens. Well, I would say to Cardinal Chao, there is no better example of a good citizen than Jimmy Lai, Martin Lee, and Cardinal Zen. But he's not speaking up for them, and I think he means something else. I think he means good party members.
Okay, great. So I think we have some time for question and answers, because we have sort of the rich expertise here. So we have the embarrassment of riches. So who wants to ask the first question? Yes.
Fascinating discussion, and really, first of all, Ben, compliments on the report, and then all of the learned perspective here that's come to bear. What I find interesting, of course, is looking at Xi Jinping. He's wrapped around his philosophy, though, is all one world, all under heaven. So why is it that he keeps grabbing on to the symbols of religion in bringing forward Xi Jinping thought and his overall philosophy to engage the Chinese peoples?
Well, I think he's searching for everything that Marx was searching for, which is utopia on earth. So, his idea of heaven is the here and now, and he's smarter than everybody, and he's going to bring it on, and he's going to be the savior of the Chinese people, and it's fascinating to see this period. Miles, you've observed it and written about how he's is trading off even their economic goals to some extent for his ideology, and his megalomania. It pushed this zero COVID policy to the breaking point, and it was. I'd love to ask Miles actually what you make of that protest, because it gave me hope that there was something really innate in every person, and that they weren't, at some point they were no longer afraid, and they came forward in the public square. Some of them were motivated by compassion for what they had heard had happened in the Uyghur neighborhood in the capital, I guess it was, of Xinjiang, and about people being burned in their homes, and the fire brigade not being able to get to them because of the zero COVID policy, and that they were lighting candles in Shanghai on the street about that. And then mega cities throughout China and universities were organizing and protesting, and the government backed down. They didn't admit that they were doing it in response to those protests, but there was no doubt in anybody's mind, really, any objective person, that this happened because of that pressure. And Miles, you're absolutely right to point to Eastern Europe. In 1989, Václav Havel was a political prisoner in Czechoslovakia. And by the end of the year, he was president of the country. It happened that suddenly 6 countries shed the communist regime, and their communist regimes and the Soviet membership or Soviet alliance. And it happened even in those countries that had Brezhnevite styled governments. So, and it was a hardliner government regime in Czechoslovakia that handed power to Václav Havel, a political prisoner, and said, here, you take over. And then there was an election validating it several months later. So I think it could happen there. It could happen suddenly. We should be prepared for it. I mean, that's the most hopeful thing I can think of is what happened in Eastern Europe. And combined with, we see massive sections of the population who are very disaffected with this regime. And the obvious ones are the ethnic and religious minorities, then the peripheral areas, and that includes the Mongolians. And now Sinicization has even come to the Uyghur Muslims who are mostly assimilated, but they have mosques that the government didn't like and started crushing them or destroying their domes over the last year. And Mongolians stamping out their customs and language. So there's huge areas that are disaffected. There's even in the heart of Han China, the majority area, large numbers, there were estimated 100 million Christians by scholars at the peak a couple years ago, 100 million Falun Gong members who've been crushed. Then there's the people affected by the one-child policy, negatively impacted by that. People affected by the zero COVID policy, where their relatives have died or the starvation or whatever. People were in complete torment during that period until they exploded. So you've got to wonder how long this policy can go, especially with the disappearance of key defense people and members of the cabinet, if you call it that, but close to the high ranks of power disappearing from being airbrushed out of history by sea. So I don't know, Miles, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, sure. So Dean, if I understand your question correctly, I will say that I think, you're talking about this kind of contradiction between tradition, culture, and communism. Don't forget, Xi Jinping is the General Secretary of the Chinese Communist Party. That is the most important title. I mean, in the West, the people call him President Xi. That's kind of a very dubiously legit title. Don't forget, Xi Jinping has a doctorate degree in Marxism, Leninism theory. So he has basically completely ideologicalized the whole nation. He has saturated the nation with intensive ideological indoctrination. Every company in China, by law, must allow to have the Chinese Communist Party sales in there. I mean, big companies, small companies, even foreign companies right now, you have to have the party control of things. So, so that basically is a kind of ideological intoxication, in my view. Yet, every Communist Party leader, including Xi Jinping himself, particularly Xi Jinping himself, always wants the world to think themselves as thoughtful, as erudite, as cultured. That's where the facade comes in. So when they cite the poem, Xi Jinping himself literally has probably like a primary school or at least middle school education. That's it. So and in the time, at the period, during the period of time where destruction of traditional culture is the main focus of the party. So even today, if you think about the communist theory, right, for socialism, communism to triumph, to prevail, tradition, heritage must be destroyed. Pure and simple. Because the communist utopia and the traditional Chinese sort of ideal for the world of harmony, I would say, they're totally different. They're very different. So I would say that don't underestimate the degree to which China is still a communist country.
Yeah. And if I could just add here, I think like throughout other communist countries, I'm thinking of North Korea in particular, the Kim regime has created their own folklore around like Kim Il-sung and now the the three-generation dynasty that the Kim family has. And a lot of that folklore is borrowed from like Christological background. And so I think if we keep in mind that the primary goal of most leaders, but communist leaders in particular, is the maintenance of power, but not just the maintenance of power, the centralization of power, I think that a lot of communist leaders see the centralizing and coalescing effect that religion has. And so if they can co-opt some of the strengths from religious tradition in order to like carry out their own ends, they're going to do so. So I think even though there's contradictions in the crackdown on religion and then the co-opting of whatever makes sense for them, it happens. That is the reality of communist regimes.
So Miles, if I could make an additional point. You mentioned the harmony. So this is one of the conflicting aspects of the Chinese policies. There's a study been done that we're a country that respects religious freedom that naturally brings what creates ethnic harmony, prosperity, and conversely, in the countries like China and elsewhere, where the government beefs up its domestic security and scares people, locking them up for their religious beliefs and calling them names like extremists and terrorists, actually brings terrorism to that country. So the Xi Jinping always said, and others also often say in their speeches, that the country's paramount concern is maintaining stability. And after that, they will have ethnic harmony. But by going the other way around, they're not even achieving that objective. This may be a little bit outdated information, but from what I know, from what I read, the Chinese spends more money on domestic security than the national defense. So it's very telling. So that's one of the contradictions. And also, the point that Ben's report raised, the missing early warning sign. This is something that the leaders in the Western democracies need to keep in mind. We don't see promoting, protecting religious freedom in the main talking points in the agenda, because I've sensed that, I've heard that, and I've seen it. I think it's a mistake. So when you fail to take an action, when you see early warning signs, that you will end up seeing genocide, end up seeing war, ethnic cleansing. As we speak, like in the last 10 years, the international community have seen a number of genocide. If you include the one that is happening against the Ukrainian people, we can count at least 4 today, including the Uyghur genocide. So we should not be shy away from sticking to our gun, the value. The religious freedom is in the Declaration of Independence and Bill of Rights that laid the foundation for the UN Declaration of Human Rights. So this is what we have, and we should not be shied away and should be emphasizing. The other side figured this out. This is important for them. Why we dancing around this important topic is something that really makes me sometimes feel disappointed in policymakers.
Let me just do one supplementary comment on that. The West has a very rich tradition of monotheism throughout history. In other words, you have monotheistic religions like Christianity, like Judaism, like Islam. It's sort of came from the same origin. And therefore, you see a lot of religious wars, confrontations over there. So religious tolerance was fought hard by the Enlightenment intellectuals, and it became kind of the rule of the universe. In the East, in China in particular, you have a high degree of religious tolerance tradition. That's because the East was predominantly a polytheistic world. That's why communism is very important. Unlike what's going on, ongoing for hundreds of years, Christianity versus Islam, we can see that kind of monotheistic confrontation. China does not have that. So it is the Chinese Communist Party that regards all religions as the enemy of its own system. So that's why it's not about one monotheistic religion against another. Rather, it's the Chinese Communist Party that absolutely cannot tolerate religious tolerance. So that's yes.
Yeah, I wanted to, propose this interpretation that Hong Kong is allowing freedom of ceremony that religion is basically boiled down to ceremony, devoid of thought, under the party's prerogative or claim over the gray matter of all ethnic Chinese globally, and the right to thought control. And so a big part of religion and spirituality is thought. It's communication, it's prayer, it's with God, none of that. So, and there's, of course, going back to Li Ma Do and so on, there's an old tradition and power in Chinese culture of ceremony. There was a ministry of rites and so on. It was very important. But in a sense, this is kind of there was a philosopher who taught me, who coined the term vulgar materialism. And this is sort of bringing religion down to just a bunch of, motions and, scripts, and that's the end of it. And to continue on this idea of setting up, of creating a government department, of course, religion in this sense of thought would be considered socially dysfunctional. This is a social anomaly. This is like an illness. So when you have a social illness, you have to regulate it, right? So that's the pretext for having government regulation of religion. But anyway, would you comment on this idea that basically it boils down to freedom of ceremony for whatever good that is by itself?
Anybody? We have a couple of minutes left, so anybody want to take? Sure.
Can I just a couple of comments. Firstly, I think that's a very good way of describing it. I think freedom of ceremony, the freedom to go to a place of worship, take part in a ceremony, but actually you're not hearing in the sermon very much that's meaningful. You're not free to think for yourself. That's a very good expression. Could I just make two very quick comments based on some of the other discussion we just had? Olivia made the parallel with North Korea, and I've also worked on North Korea for some years. And in North Korea, the Kim family is perhaps the only dictatorship in the world that is both a dynasty that is wants to be seen as a deity. And I think we are starting to see, or perhaps more than starting to see, the deification of Xi Jinping, particularly the placing of portraits of Xi Jinping and other leaders and Communist Party propaganda banners in churches alongside or even instead of religious imagery in the mainland. And we may start to see if the leadership in Hong Kong, leadership of the church in Hong Kong continues to kowtow to Beijing, we may see some of that in Hong Kong as well. But the last comment I wanted to make is throughout the history of the PRC, the Chinese Communist Party, started out wanting to eliminate religion completely. It wanted to destroy it. It wasn't able to. It drove it underground, but it didn't destroy it. When it realized it couldn't destroy it, it wanted to control it. And under the Deng Xiaoping era and up until the Xi Jinping era, and there were variations. There were periods of degrees of relaxation, not freedom, but some more relaxed times than we know today, but nevertheless control. And I think what we're seeing now is the third period, which is of wanting to coerce and co-opt religion and basically remake religion in its own image.
Yeah.
Any other last comment? Okay. Nina, you want to say?
Again, I think it's this confusion of terms that the religious leaders who are either want to go along and get along, like some of the Catholic leaders that we've seen inside China. And by the way, Cardinal Chao of Hong Kong is a very well-educated man. He has a PhD from Harvard in education theory, culture of education. And he his thesis, I looked at it, and it was about how there's a distinctive Christian culture in the schools, in the Christian schools in Hong Kong, that they believe in the dignity of the individual. And so he knows better. He knows the difference. And Ben, you had it in your report, I was surprised to see it, that he actually spoke up for free speech as recently as June.
Yeah.
And he probably knew he was going to be elevated to cardinal at that point. And for him to say that was actually an act of courage. And he has also requested, mildly, but requested the authorities to clarify what this national security law is all about because it's too vague. And anybody could be accused of a national security offense and you don't even know it. There's no notice. There's no due process. There's no red lines. It's just a vague, open-ended, arbitrary statement which can be used against your political enemy at any point. The leadership is going along with this for some reason. Again, I think it's confusing terminology, saying that they respect the Pope and everything's fine. The deal, this 2018 provisional agreement is not dead, is another thing that's been said. When China has broken it consistently since September 2021, 2021. They're doing this, I think, because they think this kind of appeasement is going to somehow mollify Xi Jinping. I mean, at the very year that they signed the deal was the very year that the rollout started of this Sinicization of religion, body of regulations. They knew it was coming. I think that earlier that spring they had given a draft or a glimpse of what was going to be required to adopt for Catholics and Christians and other religions, every religion, to start basing sermons on Xi's teachings, to start adopting the values of communism. Chinese communism, so to love the party. Those were the kinds of things that were known at that point. So I think that they think that appeasements will work, and that's their only course, and that's to fundamentally misjudge both the character of the regime and the ideology that that it defines it. So I don't think that there is going to be a leadership from that quarter anytime soon. I mean, if it's possible, I mean, people ask me, what's the solution? What other choice do they have? Well, the other choice is going underground. That's how they survived Mao, and to do a home church. And actually, the Protestants, and I say Protestants because there's only two Christian churches allowed in mainland China, and that's Protestant Church and the Catholic Church. So the Protestant churches have succeeded in weathering a lot of these storms through the house church system. And I think that the Catholics should learn a lesson from that and try to keep that going. And Hong Kong should learn a lesson from that. The Hong Kong churches should be adopting that within the family, passing on of the religion and practicing religion within the family.
Okay, with that, let me just say, so if you were to conclude, the modern world as we know it was born with the advent of a religious tolerance, which was hard fought for. That gave the modern world a freedom to freely worship, which is develop a lot of denominations of different kind of religions, and where people, all the worshipers, develop their core values. So the core value is very important. That freedom, I think, we have underappreciated, even abandoned today, because now dominate in our world is a multiculturalism, right? Multiculturalism basically means that every culture is of equal value. If everything is out of equal value, that means our core value will be no value. So that's why I myself has tremendous respect for people of faith, because you do have a core value. And for that, I'm very grateful. I mean, so thank you very much for this very thoughtful and panel, and hopefully China Center will be of further assistance on this particular issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.